Our panelists today are Brianna Perilli-Harris. She's professor of demography at the University of Southampton. And she's studied family change and including fertility decline in Ukraine and Russia for decades now. Next, we're going to hear from Cynthia Buckley. She's a professor of sociology at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and also appointed at the Population Studies Center at the University of Michigan. That's an indicator that everybody wants to hear a little bit of what Cindy has to say, including myself. And finally, we will have Martin Piotrowski, who is a scholar of migration at the University of Oklahoma. And he studied migration, marriage, and fertility also for decades in parts of Asia and more recently parts of Europe, including Poland and Ukrainians in Poland. Before we get started, I just want to make a note to our graduate students here about the importance of social networks. I was able to organize this seminar when they asked me if I could do something on armed conflict because I know all these people from graduate school. So Brianna, I went to school with in Michigan. Martin was there for a summer and I was so excited, like another migration guy. So we started talking and have known each other since then. And Cynthia was actually shared a advisor with me well before I was there, but we collegially met with our advisor at PAA and have since developed a relationship. So all those things you do with other graduate students, both here at UW and at PAA, they're really impactful and they will end you up in the situation 20 years from now where you can organize something. So with that little lesson, I will start. We're going to start with Brianna. You're on, Brianna.
Thanks. Yes. Thank you, Natalie. Yes, it is really good to have these connections. I can say also from 20 years of being in the field. And what is also interesting is that you never quite know where your path will go. And my PhD was on Ukraine, and then I went off and did work on cohabitation and marriage. And then a couple of years ago, started doing work on Ukraine again, because I realized that so few demographers study the country, and it's very rare that Ukraine appears in sociological journals or demographic journals. So I was compelled to try to better understand what was happening, especially after the separatist war of 2014. So Ukraine is unique because it has one of the world's lowest fertility rates, but it's been experiencing depopulation. But it's also one of the few countries with very low fertility that has experienced war. And as you now know, the war is all out, affecting the entire country. One of the reasons why I just want to make a short comment before we get started that this is supposed to be on measurement, data collection, and needs. And one of the reasons why Ukraine is rarely studied is because there hasn't been enough data. When I was doing my PhD, there was a Ukrainian longitudinal monitoring survey, but that ended in 2011. There's been very little data in the form of surveys. The last census was in 2001. So we've had to extrapolate and try other methods. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the studies that I've been involved with that have not been the easiest because it's not a traditional survey or even official statistic. So as I mentioned, there's been a demographic crisis with low fertility in Ukraine. I'll talk about that briefly. I have one paper with co-authors on internal displacement and subjective well-being that was using a survey, but it was not nationally representative. It was of IDPs who had left the separatist territories around 2014, and the survey itself took place in 2018. So because there has been a lack of data, my colleagues Ted Gerber and Yulia Hilevich and I decided to try focus group research, and we conducted focus groups in Eastern Ukraine in July 2021. I'll talk briefly about that study. And then once the war broke out, we, some colleagues and I from the University of Southampton, were able to do a rapid needs Facebook survey that ended up with 10,000 respondents. So I'll talk a little bit more about that too. And then I just would like to point out that I was actually a Peace Corps volunteer in Ukraine in the late 90s and met a lot of people at that time. And I ended up hosting one of my students and his family for 5 months. So I have a bit of personal connection with Ukraine as well. So demographically, Ukraine is one of the countries that's experiencing the most rapid population decline. It's next to Bulgaria and some of the other Eastern European countries with a shrinking population. Here you can see that the population peaked around 52 million in the 1990s and then has been declining ever since. And that's primarily due to low fertility. And so you can see here that there was the decline to the world's lowest fertility when I was doing my PhD in the early 2000s of 1.1. Then it went back up again. But then subsequently, after the separatist conflict that started in 2014, it seems that fertility rates have really plummeted. So before current war broke out in 2021, the total fertility rate was 1.167. And again, Ukraine is just not represented in studies on low fertility. We've got a lot of work on Japan, Italy, Spain, but very few studies that understand what is going on there. So that motivated this online research. Our goal was to better understand what people thought about depopulating areas, whether or not they could recognize that there were areas that were shrinking, or on the other hand, perhaps growing because they were accepting internally displaced persons. So we worked with the Ukrainian Survey Agency, and this study was conducted about 7 months before Russia invaded. It was online, and this is partially because of COVID, but it also gave us the unique advantage of being able to talk to people who were behind the separatist line. They were in Donetsk, where researchers, journalists, even Ukrainian researchers weren't able to go very easily. So we were able to talk to people who were in a unique situation where they had very few physical links with the outside world, but still had the virtual links to be able to hold these conversations. So it was very odd being able to talk to people who are really connected virtually, but weren't able to leave very easily, and were in a region which was very rapidly depopulating because so many people had left. So as I mentioned, one of the main goals of the research was to better understand whether or not average people understand that population decline is a problem. So some people really didn't have an opinion, but a lot of Ukrainians thought that the national population decline was a problem. We also asked about local decline and whether they could see differences in cities and rural areas. And then another issue that they talked about was having fewer children and very low fertility, economic crisis, difficulties with wages, little state support, and then also the political and social uncertainty that was due to the conflict and the pandemic and different societal pressures. So that paper is forthcoming in the Vienna Yearbook of Population Research. But I'd like to point out that our research sites were all on the front line. They're all cities that have been bombed quite extensively. So some of the villages where our research took place have been completely annihilated. We conducted focus groups in Kharkiv, which is constantly getting bombed even now, and all along the front line. So it's very difficult. And then the other major area that we conducted these focus groups was Mariupol. And I'm sure you've heard about the city, which had a 90-day siege and then finally fell to the Russians. It started off with a population of around 450,000. Now nobody knows how many people are actually in the city, still maybe 50,000 or so. They think that about 300,000 have fled into Ukraine and beyond. Another 40,000 perhaps deported to Russia. But they do know from satellite imagery that there are about 25,000 graves that they've been able to count. So the place was completely devastated, and it's really heartbreaking thinking about the people who are in my focus groups. Now, right after the war broke out, I happened to come into contact with some colleagues from our university or medicine department And they were conducting a rapid online focus group through Facebook. It was devoted to health needs, and because these researchers had worked with refugee populations before, and they really wanted a rapid response to be able to feed to WHO and other agencies. So we conducted this survey very quickly. Unfortunately, it's not at all representative, but there were about 10,000 people who answered the Facebook survey, which is relatively a large sample. So I'm not going to be able to go through it much. I just thought I would mention a couple of the main findings, which are that one question that we asked was, how many people did you leave with? How many people did you flee with? And we found out that on average, refugees fled with about 3.5 people, including themselves. So it's not just mothers and children. Often there are other family members, neighbors, people that they meet along the way who leave with them. And the IDPs are even larger. So these are larger groups than we would have expected. Also, just confirming other data, we know that the IDPs were more likely to come from the east, where there are conflict areas, and then the refugees were more likely to come from the central regions in Kyiv, indicating that there was probably more selection. So that's just a little bit about those two surveys, and I'd just like to reiterate again that Ukraine is this really unique case for demographers because of its low fertility rates and depopulation, and now there's this full-scale war. So the big question is, how long will the war last? And we have many, many more questions about how low fertility will go. Some of the demographers in Ukraine are estimating that it will go as low as 0.55 in 2023. So it could potentially be rather shocking, but we don't know, and there's a huge lack of data. And we want to think about these questions in terms of the size of the population. Will these refugees return to Ukraine? Will they go back home? How will the country deal with the IDPs? And will Ukraine's process of depopulation just continue accelerating, or will there be more of a hopeful, positive aspect where Ukrainians want to repopulate because of nationalism and their newfound Ukrainian identity? Okay, so I look forward to talking more about this and other data needs.
Thank you, Brianna. Next, Cynthia, you're on.
Okay, is the slide up? Can you see that? We're good? Okay, great. Thanks so much for this opportunity. It's really terrific both to learn from Brianna and from Martin, as well as Natalie's fine questions, but also to talk to some of the graduate students in Washington about issues related to the critical work that Natalie does on displacement, but also thinking about it in this, case, shall we say, ripped from the headlines, which is Ukraine. And so I'm going to talk just briefly, really focusing on issues of displacement and thinking about internally displaced populations in terms of how complex they are, the kinds of choices that are related to becoming internally displaced, the constraints on people moving, and the consequences of the millions of individuals that have been displaced in Ukraine since February 24. As Professor Pirelli-Harris rightfully pointed out, of course, the problem with displacement in Ukraine began in 2014 with the onset of separatist movements, again, backed by Russia, in the Donbass. And so I'll link into that a little bit more, but also to remember that Ukraine is just part of this huge global existence of displacement. Whether refugees or IDPs, we're looking at over 100 million people globally are estimated to be displaced as of the end of 2022. And in 2021 and 2022, the UN General Secretary had a high-level commission on IDPs. There were over 52,000 individuals, whether they were displaced themselves, aid workers, academics like us, um, uh, or policymakers that were involved in interviews, focus groups, mail out surveys, linked into coming up with an agenda for studying displacement. And it's a really interesting report. And one of the things that the report really calls for, that of course is near and dear to my heart, is the call for increased scholarly input on policy. There is a lot of siloing that goes on in the displacement community. And so it's really a great area to concentrate on. And that those of you at Washington are really at a place where you have amazing mentors and resources to do that with. So I'm going to focus on three things for me that really stand out in displacement, and indeed this is throughout the literature. The first one is, while we can study displacement and have studied many cases of displacement, we still don't understand tipping points, and we still don't understand selectivity. Who becomes displaced? Who is more likely to become displaced? At what point do people make the decision to leave? There is this idea that somehow displacement is choiceless, and that simply does not reflect reality. We need to think and unpack how people make choices. Secondly, we need to talk about documentation challenges. Oddly enough, in Ukraine, because UNHCR has been on the ground and active, as has IOM since 2014, there are sources of documentation for displacement. They have not necessarily been critically assessed methodologically, but they do provide an enormous amount of raw data that is ripe for demographic analysis. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. And then thirdly, when we're talking about displacement, it's not just about the people who are moving, it's about the ability of institutions within home countries to develop responses to displacement. When displacement is massive, it puts a huge strain on state capacity. When displacement is highly concentrated among specific ethnic or social groups, it may put an enormous strain on social cohesion. And so I'm going to focus on those 3 points, and I'm going to offer, just as Professor Pirelli-Harris mentioned, Ukraine is really a great instructive case in this situation. Before February of 2022, there was already monitoring in place for IDPs. Now, there are some questions about the comprehensiveness. It focused on people who were registered internally displaced, and of course, that didn't cover 100% of those who were actually displaced. But there was a longitudinal data set that had problems, but the IOM had been on the ground and were doing it, which is why the first round of the general population survey that was done to get a handle on refugees and IDPs after February 24th of 2022 was in the field and completed by March 9th, which is pretty astoundingly fast, especially if any of you have ever worked for the UN. It's also really quite hard to believe they could do anything that quickly. So we've got monitoring in place. Ukraine is an instructive case because there were really rapid movements of millions of people, both out of the country, and then as time progressed, millions of people coming back into the country. It is a rapidity of movement that is unique in terms of its size and impact in terms of most cases of displacement. So that's another unique hook and why it's an instructive case. The armed attacks in Ukraine, primarily because while there is infantry conflict and there is, the kind of grinding warfare we see going on in the East now, to a large extent, most of the armed attacks have links to aerial bombardment, and they are very fully documented. There are data sets actually about daily shellings that you can geocode. So you have a really clear case of where hostilities occur. And most importantly, mobility is open. Oftentimes, when there is conflict, particularly when a country is invaded or a specific social group is targeted, they do not have open mobility options. This is not the case in Ukraine. To the west, neighbors, I'm sure Martin will talk about this as well. Neighboring countries have been amazingly responsive to the needs of refugees coming out of Ukraine, and that enables them to be registered and counted, right? So there's all these possibilities, but there's three big questions we have here. First, who leaves? Where do they go? And when do they go? How are they making these choices? Secondly, how do open borders to the West enable us to really see the complexity of displacement? Are we gathering the right kind of data, even with these open borders? There is a lot of back and forth across borders. There's a lot of concern about double counting of movements, with people who cross into Poland, then come back to Ukraine, then go back to Poland again, whether they're being counted as one or multiple refugees. And then thirdly, we really need additional research now about how institutions can respond in the context of high levels of displacement. Let me go fast. Give you a little bit of background in terms of what we knew about displacement prior to the latest upsurge in the Russian invasion. The internally displaced population in Ukraine grew rapidly, particularly 2 years into the conflict. People really started leaving the East. It was not clear if it was whole families. Oftentimes, one family member is laid behind to look over property or agricultural assets or any other sort of assets. Older people with mobility constraints oftentimes did not want to leave and stayed in those areas, but you still have just south of 1 million IDPs officially registered in Ukraine as of 2020. What's interesting is they don't all go the same places, and the where comes in kind of interestingly here. This map with four pictures of Ukraine, the top one, the largest, is the total number of officially displaced registered Ukrainians. What we find is that they hug the line of conflict, this red border here. People left the region, but they didn't want to go too far. This is consistent with what ethnographic work by Greta Uhling and others have found, that lots of families were split. So they didn't want to go too far, because even during the most aggressive points in the Donbass conflict, there were anywhere between 8 to 16 border crossing points that were open, and there was foot traffic going back and forth across the line of conflict on a daily basis. This was even true during the beginning of the COVID pandemic. But when we break it apart, it's not where people went that's consistent across all social groups. In terms of children who were registered as official IDPs, children tended to go as far away from the conflict as possible. People in the working ages tended to be dispersed across the center and the West. Pension-aged IDPs tended to concentrate more heavily, again, right along the line of conflict. And so this gives us a little bit of insight that indeed age may be a big factor in terms of deciding when, or not deciding where one becomes displaced. And this is something we're going to need to look at in terms of the next wave of displacement. In this slide, what I've done here is just simply take the first 11 rounds of the IOM General Population Survey, which is really targeting, measuring internally displaced and potentially internally displaced populations. What this does is, towards the end, on a monthly basis, based on a survey of approximately 2,000 people. There's some estimation challenges here. There's a reason why I round to the nearest 100,000. This gives us an indicator across time about the size of the self-identified internally displaced population. See that in May of 2022, it hit the high point of 8 million. Now it's down to about 6 million as of December 5th of 2022. But what's interesting is the blue line, which is those who are not currently identifying as IDPs, but are seriously considering leaving their homeland. You see that started high, then kind of dipped down low during the summer, and many argue that it's on the rise again, that they're thinking the last round of these that came in January 5th, that you will see about 2.8 million people now considering leaving their destination. So lots of people are thinking about leaving. Some people have left. Some people have left their home district and come back. It's a complicated situation. There are some surveys out there that can give you some comparative insight into how this changes over time and how this changes by region. So the idea of where and when people leave and how that is different by age group, perhaps by rayon or district of origin, there are lots of possibilities for those analyses. And that's something I'm doing with colleagues at the University of Oslo right now. Secondly, is this idea of legibility, right? How do we document IDPs? This is a constant problem. They have citizenship in their home country. They haven't left their home country. How do we get counted? How did they get counted as IDPs? A couple of things to remember. In Ukraine, housing is a right. That may sound strange to Americans, but it's a pretty important right in Ukraine. And during the Donbas conflict, Article 19 of the Combating Terrorism Code already had set up compensation programs for people who had lost housing due to the Donbas war. Not everybody, they didn't compensate them enough, they didn't compensate them quickly, but there were already institutions on the ground that were incentivizing people to register as IDPs in hopes of getting some at least partial compensation. In March of 2022, so just a few weeks after the invasion started, the Rada in Ukraine passed a new compensation law in, again, setting up a program to help compensate people who had lost housing. They even set up, of course, with the help of the Estonians, an online portal for the DIIA program where people could get online, register, put their property loss in the database in hopes of eventual compensation. This can really help encourage people to register as IDPs. We have legal border crossings, that should help. We also have very interesting social welfare opportunities that can also make people more legible. This is particularly true in Poland and Moldova, where there are programs for kids to go to school, etc., that encourage people to become registered as IDPs. So there's some legibility here that's kind of exciting. There are also definitional challenges that alter coverage. In working with the Center for Civil Liberties in Ukraine, one of the problems in areas, as Brianna mentioned, like Mariupol, as well as even areas that we've all heard on the news, like Bucha, there are definitional challenges. If your house is damaged, but you're living on a tent on your own property, you are not counted as an IDP. Although one would argue the displacement between a house and a tent in a Ukrainian winter is pretty big. There are huge definitional challenges about having to move away from your place of residence. Then lastly, scale is a huge challenge here because we're talking about so many millions of people. In a country of only just over 37 million, most people would argue, the number of people displaced is tremendous. And so just to remember that the experience of displacement doesn't always match with um, administrative counts, and we don't always capture the lived experience of people in these data, and that's something that we need to work on as demographers. I'm going to wrap up with institutional challenges, and I'm going to use the institution that I'm most familiar with, which is healthcare. One of the things about displacement is that aside from all of the motivational issues and all of the administrative issues, is the stress it puts on the capacity of states that are already, because they have a huge displaced population, suffering from some sort of calamity. Healthcare in Ukraine is having a very, very hard time adapting to this challenge of displacement, particularly because of what appears very clearly to be purposive targeting of healthcare infrastructure and damage to healthcare facilities. The healthcare challenges in Ukraine were immense to begin with, even with amazing efforts by the Minister of Health, Elena Sabun, during her tenure to make healthcare more effective and more efficient. Healthcare challenges include COVID, the number of vaccines, boosters, surprise, surprise, after February 28th, dropped by 97%. So you're not really picking up on a lot of issues related to COVID illnesses. You have a raft of chronic conditions, everything from HIV to cardiovascular disease that require persistent and stable access to medicine. This is really hard in issues of displacement, and those are still big issues for the UN now. You also have to think about mobility challenges. Many of us saw on the newsreels the people trying to cross the borders and how hard that was. If you're old, if you're infirm, if you have mobility challenges, it is really hard to leave your place of living, even if there is a hole in the roof. This is particularly true, as my colleague Sarah Phillips would point out to you, because Russia in September of 2022 bombed the only wheelchair manufacturing factory in all of Ukraine. So healthcare, I think, is a really interesting area to bring into this debate about displacement. It's both a cause of letting people leave or having people stay, but it's also a huge consequence of the tragedies that lead to displacement. So very quickly, I just want to pull your attention to a great article that was published a few months ago in Sociologia that's talking about wartime sociology. And these shining lights of the profession pose three big questions. And this is an open call for papers for that journal. So for graduate students, if you're looking for a term paper idea, you might want to give this a try. How did different actors justify decisions taken during war? This is something I'm working on with colleagues to look at fractured families, because we have lots of people who have sent children into refugee status, but yet have remained in parents have remained in Ukraine. Part and parcel of this is because of martial law. Men in the working ages cannot leave the country because they may be needed for the armed forces. But people have sent, according to reports, and again, we're lacking data here, sent more and more children to the West to get out of the country, to keep their kids safe. This isn't unlike what we saw in Donbass. I think this is also one of the reasons Professor Pirelli-Harris's talk was so important, because initially analyses of data from Poland and Romania were talking about, wow, all these big families are coming in, are leaving Ukraine. And I knew from Professor Pirelli-Harris's work is that there were no big families in Ukraine. What was going on is that people were taking groups of children. So, as one of my informants said, right, You send the kids away with the sister-in-law, but she didn't want to leave her husband. This gives us insight into how people are making decisions. Secondly, how do people view their belief system? How do they maintain identities? Comes through in a lot of the responses we have from individuals who haven't left, that say, the sirens came, they cut off the heat, they cut off the water. We've been here so long now, we've been through it all, we're not moving now. And so a different kind of reality. Then lastly, thinking about how things will end in the future, I think we really need to focus on incorporating ideas of war crimes and destruction into the way we think about displacement. I would argue very strongly, and have in other places, that the Russian focus on infrastructural targeting is not only a means of causing harm today, it is a conscious and deliberate effort to make sure that Ukrainians pay for this invasion even after the cessation of hostilities. And part and parcel of that is the mass destruction of civilian households. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cindy. Can you stop share?
Yep.
And then Martin, you're on.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can see your screen, but it's not in the slideshow. We can see your whole screen behind that.
Okay, let me stop sharing. Maybe
You stop sharing, open the slideshow, and then
I'll just share the slideshow. How's that?
start the slideshow.
Good.
Yes.
Perfect. All right. Well, I want to start by saying thank you for having me. Thank you for attending. I guess I've studied migration for most of my academic career. Although I would say that refugee studies hasn't really been my home base. Although Natalie didn't mention this. Turned out that about a year ago, I was in Warsaw on a Fulbright grant, and this special operation took place. Poland received a flood of millions of refugees. And so I sort of had the chance to meet a number of people from Ukraine before the special operation and then following. And so it hits close to home for me, because I've actually met people going through this process. And when I was younger, I myself was a refugee. My parents and I left Poland in the early 1980s. So in more ways than one, this whole topic sort of hit close to home to me, and I've gotten sort of interested in it from these experiences. And so my talk today is basically about Ukrainian refugees in Poland, sort of what we know, why it's an important topic. And so I just wanted to start out by talking about the number of people moving from Ukraine to Poland and other parts of the European Union. And so I've gotten some data from the United Nations High Council on Refugees, and they've estimated that over 7.8 million people were Ukrainian refugees into parts of Europe. And of those, about 1.5 million were recorded as residing in Poland. So Poland actually had the highest number of refugees of any EU country, and was only second to the Russian Federation in terms of the total number of recorded refugees from Ukraine. The Russian Federation had about 2.8 million people. And so of those people who were crossing the border out of war-stricken Ukraine, about 93% were Ukrainian citizens. And just kind of a brief history of contemporary migration from Ukraine to Poland. Immigration of citizens of the ex-Soviet republics, including Ukraine, started basically in the 1980s. Most of that migration was circular. Initially, a lot of people were moving as sort of petty traders, but eventually that migration was sort of shaped into labor migration. There was a visa framework that was introduced in the year 2003, but at the time, Ukrainians could easily obtain free visas. It wasn't until Poland entered the Schengen zone in 2007, just a few years after EU accession, that these visas became sort of less accessible and more costly, and it made it more difficult for Ukrainians to come to Poland. And so there were some new regulations that were put in place. that affected Ukrainians and other former USSR nationals that came into effect in 2006. And that basically required that people come for only a short period of time, a 6-month duration. And so a lot of Ukrainians would sort of move seasonally and work in Poland for about 6 months and go back and forth between Poland and Ukraine. Now, it turns out that actually estimating the number of Ukrainians in Poland is not as straightforward as one might think. There's no good records, but I've gotten some information from a paper written by Streletsky and his colleagues that was published in the Review of World Economics. And he basically used all the existing data sources that he could find to create a model of how many employed Ukrainians were in the Polish economy throughout different years. So you can see this graph, the number of Ukrainians who were employed in Poland, presumably migrants, were basically increasing since the early 2000s, but really took off in 2014. And as sort of Cynthia and Brianna alluded to, this is the kind of the beginning of the separatist movements that were backed by Russia, the Russian annexation of Crimea. It was really following that period that a lot more Ukrainians were migrating to Poland. And unfortunately, it's difficult to find good information on refugees. I guess the major caveat to what I'm about to tell you is that it's a hard to find population. It's difficult to get good numbers. So we should kind of bear that in mind when I'm describing some of these statistics that I'm going to be talking about in a second. The primary sources that I found about Ukrainians in Poland come from Facebook or cell phone data, and then a survey conducted by the National Bank of Poland by one of my colleagues, Paweł Streletsky, who I've been sort of co-authoring papers with. And so I'll start with the Facebook cell phone data. Some analysis by Andrew Schroeder, who's the Vice President of Research and Analysis at Direct Relief, used some social media data from Meta or Facebook, and was tracking some of the movements of the earliest refugees. Those are the people who were coming in the most recent wave between February 24th and 25th, 2022. And his team found that basically most of the people moving in those first few days had access to cars. A lot of them sort of bypassed the official intake procedures that a lot of the later refugees were going through, and they tended to sort of opt to stay with family and friends. And so here's sort of a graphic that they created. This is basically showing the kind of the fuchsia bluish lines to sort of show the population movements in terms of standard deviations. You can see that most of the movement that was happening in the days following the initial invasion were happening sort of eastern Poland near the Ukrainian border, which I guess makes sense. And a lot of this movement was happening in the areas of Lublin and the Polish city of Rzeszów. And so the rest of the information I'm going to talk to you about today comes from a report from the National Bank of Poland. So the National Bank of Poland actually created a survey and conducted a survey between the 13th of April and the 12th of May, 2002. And they conducted interviews with over 3,000 adult refugees from Ukraine. And these are people who all arrived in Poland after the 24th of February. And the sample largely consists of people that they met in offices and places of what they call collective accommodation in 16 voivodeships of capital cities throughout Poland. Now, a voivodeship in Poland is sort of like a large administrative unit, kind of like a state. And what they did is they used a random quota sampling strategy. And they were basically trying to avoid a kind of so-called snowball effect, and that they were trying to avoid serving people who were staying together or had known each other. So they would get a diverse pool of refugees to collect data about. And so the results were written up in a report titled The Living and Economic Situation of Ukrainian Refugees in Poland, a report of questionnaire survey conducted by MBP and regional branches. And so I should mention that these results are the statistics I'm going to show you are weighted. They're weighted by the distribution of immigrants by county and age and gender, consistent with their availability of data from the National Identification System, or PESEL. So PESEL is kind of like a social security number. It's thought that about 1.3 million Ukrainians are actually registered to get a Polish identification number, or PESEL, which entitles them to certain access to entitlements. And so presumably one could use that to actually sample them, although I think in practice, some of my Polish colleagues have been kind of pessimistic about the possibility of actually doing that. So here are some of the major findings from that report. So first, the refugees arriving into Poland from Ukraine were representative of all regions, but there seems to be sort of an above average number coming from war zones that were relatively well connected with Poland. So places like Kyiv, parts of central Ukraine and the southern regions. I believe Brianna mentioned something about this as well. About 13% of the refugees entered Poland across the border, other than that of the Ukrainian border. So perhaps they went through Hungary, through Slovakia, on into Poland. By the end of April, beginning of May, approximately 1.5 million refugees from Ukraine were residing in Poland. Most of them are women, which shouldn't be very surprising. There were some significant restrictions on the movement of men, and so about 60% of these women were arriving together with their children. Usually, they had 1 or 2 children. About a quarter, 24%, had arrived alone, and these are mainly women below the age of 29 or above the age of 60. A staggering high number, about 50%, had a university degree, which is much higher than the share of people with university degrees in the Ukrainian population as a whole. So like a lot of the results that we find from other migration studies that suggest that there's some positive selection of migrants in terms of their educational credentials. Surprisingly, a lot of these refugees were active in the labor market. About a third already had work or had arranged a job, and another half were looking for work. But we're mainly doing so on a kind of a part-time basis, and that may have to do with the fact that many of them are taking care of small children, possibly without their spouse. 50% currently resided in Poland, had never been to Poland and had no contacts with people who previously visited Poland. So that's perhaps suggestive that maybe social networks aren't operating quite as much as maybe what we find in other migration streams. And a considerable part of those refugees, 46%, did not speak Polish. In terms of other major findings, many of the refugees were provided some form of assistance or provision of aid, but that mostly came in the form of accommodation. So a combination of local authorities, the government, a lot of Polish families, and sometimes even compatriots already living in Poland provided housing for the people who are coming over. About a third of the refugees that were sampled in the survey reported that they were paying some kind of rent through their own funds. And 43% declared that they received no other benefits other than just accommodations. And when they were asked about what kinds of accommodations that they would like to have in order to make it easier for them to stay in Poland, most of them mentioned things like Polish language classes, assistance finding jobs, and access to healthcare as things that would make it easier for them to want to stay longer. About 30% of them reported that they sent some sort of support or provision of aid in kind or financial assistance in the form of remittances to either family or humanitarian organizations in Ukraine. This is most common among people, especially those who are gainfully employed. About 44% of those people sent remittances. And about 2/3 of the refugees declared that they don't intend to stay in Poland for very long. That is, they're planning a temporary stay of less than about a year. Typically, it was young men who were most interested in staying permanently. Women, especially those with children who were single in Poland, but maybe had a partner in Ukraine, were the most likely to want to return to Ukraine. And many indicated that if the war came to a rapid end, which of course it still hasn't, they would shorten their plans to stay in Poland and return to Ukraine much sooner. And those with a university degree, presumably those who had trouble finding a meaningful job in Poland, were also the most likely to say that they desired returning to Ukraine within a year. And only a small percentage, about 5%, want to leave Poland and go on to another country. Those declarations are often made by people who left Ukraine by themselves, and often by those who worked in the IT sector, who possibly could get very high-paying jobs in other parts of Western Europe if they moved on. Also, it was found that a relatively large number of those who moved to Rzeszów, remember that was the place along the border where a lot of the initial people moved to, suggested that they were planning on moving westward and had further travel plans beyond Poland. And so that's basically all that I have. I look forward to the Q&A session.
All right, thank you, Martin. Sarah, I think you're going to manage the Q&A. Sarah Curran?
Sorry. Hi. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Well, we have a few minutes left, 10 minutes left in the seminar. Thank you all very much. That was great. We don't have any questions in the Q&A. So Natalie, why don't you get us started?
Okay, I will have a million questions for these folks. I want to start with Martin because we just ended with you. So what's the Polish government think of all this? I know Syrian refugees. I mean, I find it astounding that Poland hosts the greatest number of Ukrainian refugees, whereas with Syrian refugees, Poland hosted the smallest number.
Yes, they did not want them. I think
So how do they feel about the Ukrainian, what's going on, and what might be the data?
I maybe want to stay away from some of the racial connotations of the Syrians versus Ukrainians, but I think one thing that I've heard officials from the Polish government say is that we have been taking refugees. We've been taking refugees since 2014, since the Russian invasion began. And so, you know, in my time in Warsaw, I've actually talked to people who have left Eastern Ukraine for Poland. So it's not like that Poland didn't take refugees. It's true they didn't take Syrian refugees. And I think many of them kind of sort of say, well, we prefer people who will like more easily integrate into our society, things of that nature. But in terms of what they think of the current crisis, I think the Polish government recognizes that Ukraine's success in this war, this special operation, whatever you want to call it, is critical for Poland's safety as well, right? So I think that they see Poland and Ukrainian interests as being highly intertwined. So I think they want to do everything that they can to help these Ukrainian refugees and the Ukrainian government get through this, win this war. Although I have heard that maybe some public sentiment maybe is starting to change a little bit. Maybe people aren't as enthusiastic about hosting some of these refugees to the point that they used to be. So I don't know. How's that as an answer?
I have another
Okay,
question.
now we have questions in the Q&A. Somebody who's anonymous, and I don't know who they are, has some questions for you, Cynthia. Publications on this topic. Any direction for us to read more? Another same person, I suppose, is asking, can you reflect further on how you navigate the balance between ever-changing, unreliable data and the need to keep conducting research in real time? And then Cynthia also mentioned compensation for loss of housing in Ukraine. Is this compensation available for people who left, or does it just mean replacement housing? I'm thinking of refugees outside of Ukraine whose homes were destroyed.
Okay.
So it looks a lot of, why don't you lead us off, Cynthia, and then Martin and Brianna, you can chime in maybe with some additional thoughts.
Okay. So I've got a couple of pieces, one on healthcare, another one on damage to healthcare infrastructure, another one on state capacity during the COVID crisis. And if you get an email, I'd be happy to send them. I also want to strongly encourage people to utilize the DTM website to pull up UNHCR publications. There are surveys from IOM, from UNHCR. It is very hard getting that raw data, but you have all the reports there. So there's lots of resources out there. I've got several pieces in the queue, but academic publication and breaking news don't go together very nicely. So just get in touch with me. I can send you some things that are in print. And then lastly, on the housing compensation, in March 2022, like I said, the Duma, or the RADA set up the system. The DIIA web portal is functioning. Some people, again, we're talking about under 3,000, but some people have gotten partial compensation and started rebuilding houses. And you can do so even if you are out, you can file for your compensation even if you are outside the country. For obvious reasons, they're focusing most on people who are internally displaced so that they can get them housed as winter progresses. Those are great questions. Thanks so much.
Can I say something? Data question. Yeah, so it's quite tricky, and there's not a very good sampling framework in Ukraine because there hasn't been a census since 2001. And I think that's why there are so few studies on Ukraine and have been previously. But that's why we also went to focus groups and we're trying different alternative methods. The Facebook survey was another one. There's no sampling framework. We don't know how representative it is. But on the other hand, it's something. The problem is that, realistically speaking, you can't get these papers published very easily in really good journals. The data quality is just not acceptable for major journals, unfortunately. So it's risky. I'm a professor. I have the luxury of being able to work on these types of studies now. I will be honest and say that this is not what I made my career on, because you get rejections and you can't get them accepted into really high quality papers. And it's the same with the qualitative data. We've gotten some papers published, and I have on Ukraine over the years. But nonetheless, I think it's really important work. And I think you have to think about it as possibly informing the debate and keeping the topic relevant and talked about in demographic circles. I mean, for me, when I go to European Population Conference or the PAA, at least being able to say something about the country reminds people that there are other alternative models of fertility decline, for example, or family formation. And I think that's really important to try to broaden out our understanding of the world, and especially in terms of a conflict situation.
Thank you. There we have, we're 1 minute shy here. Take a look at the Q&A team, Martin, and then if you have, I'm going to turn to you, Martin, for any feedback, anything you'd like to say on the first set of questions, especially around the data. But
okay, well,
there are lots of good questions, so you can
about data, since I've given a bit of time to think about it. On the Poland front, I think like the data that come from the National Bank of Poland are probably as good as you can get in under the circumstances. The problem is that they're collecting data that is a little bit limited, right? I mean, they're really interested in how these refugees are assimilating to Polish culture, how they're integrating into the labor market. I think as a sociologist, somebody studying migration, I would want like a migration history, right? Or some further information about these people's experiences that just don't get asked by like a bank collecting data, right? So I mean, I think that the solution is basically just to kind of collect your own data if you can get the resources to do it. And of course, that's tricky. So.
All right. I'm going to let us go over a little. We have, I see some grads. So Larissa Ozarensky asked to Brianna, considering the challenges you mentioned, do you have recommendations for getting qualitative work published on Ukrainian refugees now? What kinds of, I think she means what kinds of topics, priority topics or considerations should people make early on right now when preparing publications or research?
Well, I guess I want to say high quality qualitative research. There's a really good article in JMF about the Journal of Marriage and Family on how to write high quality qualitative studies. So certainly, I mean, I also conducted a project on using focus groups around Europe, and that was published in Demographic Research. So the demography journals are moving into publishing qualitative work. So it is definitely appreciated in sociology as well. Yeah, so I mean, it's difficult, but I would encourage it for demographers as well as sociologists. It's much more natural for sociologists to use qualitative methods, but demographers have really learned a lot of insights using these types of methods.
So Kim asked a question to Martin about the life course and the sort of the draft eligible, how the Ukrainian refugees may or might not be draft eligible and how that would affect.
I would think if they're draft eligible, they probably wouldn't be able to leave Ukraine in the first place. There may be some men who are, in Poland from Ukraine before the 24th, before the restrictions were put in place, that maybe would be draft eligible if they went back. And I have talked to some people about that. They were kind of reluctant to even talk about some of these things with me. So I don't have a really good answer for that. But I'd be surprised if the people who were refugees who are male are draft eligible, because I don't think they could get out in the first place.
Colin Reed asked a question about how do you see declining birth rates and other demographic trends potentially impacting strengthening the appeal of far-right extremism. I recall the phrase said in this panel, Ukrainians want to repopulate due to nationalism.
Yeah, so that was me. And perhaps that was not the right phrase to use, but I have heard that Ukrainians who have had babies during this war, it helped, I don't want to say they justify the difficulties, but they certainly raise this child for not for nationalist reasons. I'm having a hard time explaining it, but they draw on the new Ukrainian identity as a way to help them get through these difficult periods. I think that's the best way of putting it. I would also like to say that that the Ukrainian state has not explicitly, in a pro-natalist manner, encouraged childbearing like Russia has. Putin had a very pro-natalist orientation, and his maternity capital and various other measures were targeted at trying to raise the fertility rate. Ukraine has implemented some family policies, maternity policies, and child payments, which have helped, but they haven't so far been explicitly pro-natalist. We will see if this changes later on once the hostilities end.
And for anonymous attendee and Barry Levy's questions and Kim Cornick's, there are some good answers from Cynthia and Martin in the Q&A. I'm not going to. We're over time, 5 minutes. We've had a strong staying power among our audience, so that's great. We're in the middle of our quarter, so I think that's a testament to a fantastic panel, and want to thank Natalie for organizing this. And I mean, it is obviously a timely one, but it's one that seems to be a subject that really deserves ongoing attention from all of us, not only about Ukraine, but just about the impact of war and on demographic dynamics. And I'm grateful for Natalie for carrying that water for us at CSDE, and for this collective and everyone who participated, including our panelists. So thank you, everyone. I hope you have a good weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks a lot. Well, can I maybe make a plug that we all try to meet at some point to talk about our project?
We are happy to host anything anytime. Natalie knows. We just got our Center grant renewed.
Congratulations. Very good.
So,
Congratulations.
Can we take up participants? So we have about 5 minutes.
yeah, so I think it's I think Mikola can just stop the recording. I hope she's on.
I am on.
Okay, you can stop the recording.
Yes.
But we'll stay.
So,
Recording is stopped.
Okay, and then I can leave too. I think you can stay unless you want me to. Let's see. No, I'm gonna make Natalie a host.
okay.
We still have 12 participants here. Can we kick them off? It's odd to have our discussion kind of weird anonymous.
Okay,
I did have a question. I don't know, Natalie, for you or for Sarah. So there's a UN organizational panel on healthcare that meets every 2 weeks. You have to get up kind of early in the morning. But if you have students who are interested, we are opening up a few slots for scientific observers. And the idea would then be they can help. They can get linked with organizations in Ukraine working on these issues. And so if you have any students who are really seriously interested, would you send them my way?
Can you repeat, you're kind of breaking up seriously.
Oh dear.
What exactly would they do? Just